So you've clicked on a thumbnail about tax havens, which means that you want to get your head around what a tax haven actually is, and also what are these shell corporations and what's the whole process and how does that side of it work. So the video will be divided into 3 components. First being what a tax haven country actually is. The second component being what are the uses for these tax havens, and the third component being what persons and corporations are utilizing these tax havens, and also how do we know who these individuals who are utilizing these services are. So let's get into it. So part 1, what actually is a tax haven? Well, the word tax havens itself is actually just a nickname, and the proper name for it is an Offshore Financial Centre, or an OFC. And they attract foreign investors with 3 very, very big carrots. So the first carrot being is that they either have an extremely low or non-existent tax rate. The second carrot being is that it's offshore from the depositor's main country, meaning that the assets cannot be seized by that person's home country. And the third big carrot is depositor secrecy, meaning that no foreign government can find out who actually owns these accounts if they really wanted to. So in regards to the secrecy component, the Swiss banks were basically the only country doing this in the old days, but now other countries have sort of copied this business model to make more competitive offshore financial centers than what Switzerland has. But in the majority of them, you can register what is known as a shell corporation or a shell company. And if Interpol were to want to investigate this shell company, they won't be able to get past the name of that shell company, and so they have no way of knowing where the true account holder is actually from or who the account holder even is. So kind of just think of it like a VPN except for money. And whilst we're speaking about VPNs, it is very important to keep your data and just kidding, I'm not going to do an ad about VPNs. I'm way too small a YouTuber to get people paying me to say stuff like that. Anyway, my bad jokes aside, let's look at who some of the 10 biggest offshore financial centers are in the world. And the rank depends on depositor secrecy, low or non-existent corporate tax rates, and how much money is moving in and out of a country as a comparable ratio to how much money should be moving in and out of a country of that size and that population and that GDP. And that, as an example of how these rankings differ here, if you look at the top 5 here, the Netherlands and Switzerland have very high depositor secrecy, but they have a normal tax rate. Whereas the top 3 here have very high secrecy and non-existent or 0 tax rates. So now that brings us over to part 2 of this video for why people use them and what purposes do these offshore financial havens actually serve. So reason number 1, or reason number A, or reason letter A, is tax dodging or tax avoidance. And this is obviously the most common use for using these offshore financial centers. And how does this actually work? Well, let's just say that you're running a successful business in your home country, whether it be Australia or the United States. Now, the United States has a corporate tax rate of 21%. Meanwhile, the British Virgin Islands, they have a corporate tax rate of 0%. And so naturally, you want to make it look like that all of your profits are coming from the British Virgin Islands rather than from your home country. And so how does one actually achieve this? So if a successful business wanted to avoid paying their fair share in taxes and also increase the financial tax burden for the rest of us, what they can do, figure out something that the business in the home country needs, like say a technology as an example. So then what they could do is they could gift that technology patent or that technology license to their business in the British Virgin Islands. And then they can forecast how much profit they're expecting to make that financial year, and then basically charge that exact amount and a licensing fee in order to use that patent back to the home country. And so after they paid that licensing fee to the British Virgin Islands business, they'd then be left with roughly about a $0 profit. They just would have exactly broken even. Meanwhile, the business in the British Virgin Islands would have a phenomenal profit from the licensing fees and due to the no overheads that they have over there. And therefore, they now have made a $0 profit for where the tax is 30%, and 30% on 0 is obviously 0. And the entirety of the profits that are now at the British Virgin Islands will be taxed at a 0% rate. And so now I'll move on to the second reason, or part B, and so that is secrecy. And this is actually a little bit of a legitimate use for an offshore financial center. And so for those who are famously rich, whether they be celebrities or very famous corporations that very often trade under shell corporations, and therefore they'll prevent themselves from being constantly ripped off. And another benefit about this secrecy as well, they can also make large business moves whilst keeping it a secret from their competitors. And so this is actually a bit of a legitimate use for a shell corporation in an offshore financial center. But this is probably one of the few honest reasons out of the many dishonest reasons for why someone would use them. And now let's go to the third reason, or reason number C, or letter C, for why someone would use these, and this is protection from asset confiscation. Now, this isn't really a risk for those of us who are from free and democratic countries, but for those of us that are unlucky enough to be born in an authoritative dictatorship, the risk of the government confiscating your entire life's work is very high. And so the only way that they can actually keep their assets safe is if the authoritative government does not even know about them. And so that is another legitimate, honest reason for why someone would want to keep their wealth in an offshore financial haven. It is also of use of people from free and democratic societies who want to hide their assets from either spouses or creditors. So that part of it's not so honest, and reason number 4, or the reason D, is to launder YouTube likes. Launder money. Bit of a Freudian slip there, right? And furthermore, if a party were to be receiving large amounts of money for basically doing nothing, that obviously is a bit of a red flag. And so the way that many criminal organizations get around this is that the party that they're trying to give the money to would launch a legitimate business alongside their illegitimate business. And then they'll receive overpayments from shell corporations for their legitimate business. As an example of this, if a US politician was willing to receive money for the Kremlin in order to work under Russian influence, they could build some apartment complexes and then sell the apartment complexes for inflated prices to the Kremlin through these Cayman Island shell accounts. I'm just saying that's a hypothetical example. I'm not saying that's actually happened. We're also talking about Russia. That brings us to point number 5, or point E, and that is to get around sanctions. And so here's actually a real world example of, so a few years back, I'm sure that you remember how Syria had economic sanctions placed upon them. And so this obviously grinded Syria's war machine to a halt. Well, actually it didn't, because they were using shell corporations in order to pay for munitions and fuel to finance their war effort. And the reason that we know about this is through a leak known as the Pandora papers, which I will discuss at the next part of the video. Well, actually, come to think of it, I'm actually up to that part of that video now. So let's get into who the customers are of these offshore financial centers and how do we know that these people are the customers of the offshore financial centers. So part number 3, that. Well, the majority of what we know about this comes from 3 major leaks that have happened within the last 10 years, and they're known as the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, and the Pandora Papers. So the first was the Panama Papers, and this was released to the world on April 16, 2016. And this had records from the 1970s through to 2013, and it was leaked from an insider who worked at the law firm Mossack Fonseca, who made it very clear that if his identity were to be revealed, it'd be a guaranteed death sentence. And so, for that reason, we obviously do not know who the leaker is. And so this leaker sent it to a German newspaper by the name of... I'm not even going to try to say that, but you can see the letters on the screen and you can try to pronounce it. Anyway, this German newspaper shared it with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who have about 400 members working with them all over the world. And the reason that they did this was that because there are so many pages and so many documents to get through. Eventually this consortium did get through it, which is why it took from 2013 to 2016 to actually release it to the public. And the original leaker also stated that 95% of the work that they do is to sell vehicles for their clients to avoid paying taxes in their home countries. And in that leak, there was some pretty fascinating stuff, but before we could even get our heads completely around it, there was another leak, and this is from a law firm called Appleby in 2017. And so this is known as the Paradise Papers, and this too was also leaked to German newspaper. Okay, nice try. And just when we think we can't get any more leaks, we get a third leak known as the Pandora Papers, and this was leaked in the 3rd of October in 2021, so right in the middle of the whole COVID drama, which is why you may have missed it. And this is leaked to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and as far as which newspaper this one was originally leaked to, that is actually a secret, so I'm assuming that it's not this German newspaper this time. So what did these 3 leaks or these 3 papers reveal? Well, it either named directly or an immediate family member of the following persons: Vladimir Putin. And by the way, this is a way that he could get around sanctions with what's going on in Ukraine right now, but anyway, Tony Blair, Prince Charles, and his mum, David Cameron, the King of Saudi Arabia, Jackie Chan, Simon Cowell, Shakira, Claudia Schiffer, Sachin Tendulkar, that's the Indian cricket legend, Modi, and there are a few more names. In fact, instead of actually going over everyone's names, I'll just mention the countries whose leadership have been implicated. So there was Kenya, Montenegro, Ukraine, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Gabon, Ecuador, Lebanon, Argentina, and Pakistan. But the biggest scandal out of all of this, though, was from the Icelandic Prime Minister. He was a man by the name of... what's with the big words? Sigmunda Davio Gunnlaugsson. Now, through his shell corporations, he had stocks in 3 struggling banks. And this is a problem, though, because he was actually representing the government in negotiations against these banks for bailouts. And so that is obviously a big conflict of interest, and this obviously had consequences, and he lost his job in the coming days as soon as this was revealed to the public. And the public had every right to be angry, and whew, they were. And that now brings us to corporations. So there's Aliens, Apple, McDonald's, Nike, Siemens, Disney, Twitter, Uber, Walmart, and Yahoo have all been named in these papers. So out of all the parties that I've just mentioned, I should really point out 2 big things about this. And the first is that out of all of these parties, this is only what we know about. And we only know about this because of insider leaks from 3 law firms, meaning that there's probably a lot more names that are using these offshore financial centers that we are totally oblivious to. And the second takeaway about this is that every party that uses an offshore financial center is not necessarily doing it for bad reasons, such as tax avoidance, as they may just be wanting to do business without the brand name or the fact that they're famously rich getting in the way of doing day-to-day business. So to look at the merits of all the parties that are doing this on a good or bad basis really does require a bit more of an individual case-by-case analysis as opposed to saying they're all good or they're all bad. But for the overwhelming majority of them, I have my opinion about what their intentions are, as I'm sure that you do now as well.